Welcome to this video. I decided to record this video because I wanted to give a concise and simple explanation of some of the basic foundations of this teaching. Over time I found that one of the most important things in any spiritual teaching for anybody is to have a really basic and simple understanding of that teaching. And the reason for that is because as one gets involved in a spiritual teaching, it's really easy to lose sight of the basics or the foundations. And since I view the foundations of the spiritual teaching as so important, I wanted to record this video so that I could speak to you and reiterate what those foundations are. So in this first video, I want to talk about the foundations of the teachings. And in the second video, I'll talk about the application, the how-tos of the teaching. But it's a good idea to start with the foundation. And the foundation of this teaching really comes down to four basic principles, you might say. And one of those principles is that suffering is caused by identification with egoic consciousness. And when we identify with egoic consciousness, we go unconscious or become unaware of our true nature as conscious spirit. So this sort of first principle, that suffering is caused by being caught in and identified in what I call egoic consciousness. So egoic consciousness is something that the vast majority of people live in almost all the time. Humanity is, by and large, caught in this realm of egoic consciousness, and therefore manifests it in the way that we human beings live our lives both individually and collectively. So the world we see, the human world we see, is a manifestation of our collective state of consciousness. And since our collective state of consciousness is, by and large, identified with the egoic structure, that's what we see when we look into the human world and how we act and behave and relate to oneself, to each other, and to the world around us. So it's very, very important that we see and come to understand that this act of being identified with egoic consciousness is literally the root of all suffering. And so it's this root of all suffering that has to be really closely examined and looked at. And as I said, when we are caught in the egoic state of consciousness, we go to sleep, as it were, or we become unaware or unconscious of our true nature. And our true nature is something I call conscious spirit. Now, even though I give it a name like conscious spirit, our true nature is not really something that can be explained in words or defined in words. But since we have to use words in some sense, a spiritual teaching is basically words and ideas and concepts, that I use this word conscious spirit to indicate what it is that we truly and really are. And so the first real basic principle of this teaching is very, very important to understand. Usually we attribute our suffering, our struggles, to something outside of ourselves. We attribute our suffering to other people, to situations outside of ourselves, to life outside of ourselves, to all sorts of external influences is what we usually blame suffering on. I'm suffering because life isn't going the way I wanted to. I'm suffering because I'm not the person I want to be. I'm suffering because of the past memory that I'm identified with. But really, when we start to examine it very closely, we start to see that the suffering is really caused by identifying with certain patterns of thinking.